I want to thank everyone for joining this session. New Mexico proves the effects of school policies and practices on sexual violence among LGBTQ students. And I will hand it over to Mo for a second to do an intro for the Nsvrc.
Hey, thanks so much. This is Mo. I'm from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. We are really happy to be sponsoring this prevention track. It's part of the work that we do as one of the technical assistance providers for states and territories who receive RPE funding, and that stands for Rape Prevention and Education funding. That's funding that comes through VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and we are partners with Prevent, Connect, and CalCASA in this work. And so I'm just really excited to be here with all of you. There's a couple things I want to share with you specifically about Nsvrc. If you've been to some of the other prevention workshops, you've probably heard me say this exact same thing, but I really mean it. So the first one is that we have been working on becoming an anti-racist organization. And the reason I want to share that is because we know that we'll never be able to end sexual violence without ending racism and all other forms of oppression. And we really have been doing some deep looking at how is our movement shaped in racist ways, how is our organization shaped in ways that we need to really examine and dig deep and change, and how individually can we really become anti-racist in this work. So what I want to do is invite you, if you're doing similar work in your organizations, to reach out to us and we can talk about it. I'm always interested in having this conversation. And I did have one person reach out to me so far. So maybe you could be the second or third or fifth. The other thing I want to let you know is that we have access to articles. So if you ever want a research article, whether you know which one it is or not, if you just know a topic of what you want, please reach out to us. I'll put the email that you can best reach us at in the text chat. It's resources@nsvrc.org. But we are really happy to send those to you. So yeah, feel free to contact us, and thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Mo. Excited to see who reaches out to you. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers really quickly. We have Theresa Cruz coming from the University of New Mexico. Welcome. And then we also have Dee Ross also coming from the University of New Mexico. We have some great bios from them, but I will let them take it away. I know we have a lot to cover today. So I'll hand it over to our presenters and go ahead and stop sharing and give you all a moment to share your screens.
Great, thank you so much, Mo, Sarah, Marcella. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Theresa Cruz, and I'm an epidemiologist by training. I work at the University of New Mexico at the Prevention Research Center in Albuquerque, and I've had an interest in injury and violence prevention for 20 years. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm just really happy to be here and have the opportunity to present our research today. I'm here with my colleague, Dee Ross Reed. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Dee?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dee Ross Reed. I use they, them pronouns. This is not my real home in the background. And I am an evaluator living and working in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I have been to this conference many times. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today and happy to see some colleagues. Thank you so much.
All right, so before we get into the specifics of our research, we'd like to start off with a game called Jeopardy. It's a spin-off, obviously, of Jeopardy, and we hope it'll be a good introduction to our work and some of the concepts we're going to be talking about today. I know I'm no Alex Trebek, but I'm going to do my best with the format. I'd like to start off with some Jeopardy ground rules. Since you're all on mute, you'll need to either enter your responses into the chat room. And please remember, as with Jeopardy, to write your answer in the form of a question. You need to wait until I finish reading the question to enter your response. If you see that your response is already entered in the chat, there's no reason or need to respond if it's already there. And we're going to have Sarah monitoring the chat for us. She's going to do her best to identify the first correct response, but please do not be competitive. This is just for fun. If we mess up, it's an accident. There's no penalties for anybody. So please give us the benefit of the doubt. We're trying our best. We haven't done this before with, 300 to 500 people. Whoever wins a question, though, will be asked to select the next topic. And that'll be done again in the chat, that you would choose the topic and the dollar amount. And just a disclaimer, you will not win hundreds or thousands of dollars by playing the game, but hopefully the overall winner will receive a small prize from us here in Albuquerque. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the game board. Okay, so as you can see, we've got several topic areas: vocab, sex ed, resilience, and school practices. And so Dee, would you like to make the first selection just to get us started?
Let's start with vocab for 400.
Okay, and that answer is the A in LGBTQIA can represent both of these words. 2 words we're looking for. And we already have answers. Sarah, who was the first to respond?
I'm actually still looking. Oh, I think I found the first person to give 2 answers, and to the best of my knowledge, that would be Kelly McGuire. What is asexual and ally?
Awesome. So did you say Elliot?
Kelly McGuire.
Kelly. So Kelly, could you go ahead and enter into the chat which category and dollar amount you'd like to select next? Sex ed for $800. Ooh, jumping for big money. This thin, flexible piece of latex protects against direct mouth to genital or mouth to anus contact during oral sex. Okay, we have the answers. Sarah, who was first?
I think we have Lizzie Small at what is a dental dam?
Exactly. Good job, Lizzie. Then Lizzie, would you like to enter your selection of topic and dollar amount in the chat box? All right, she's selecting resilience for $600. Could we have that question, please, or that answer? Having a strong connection to a teacher or other caring adult at school reflects this level of the socio-ecological model. All right, do we have an answer, Sarah?
We sure do. We have Maddie Rhodes at what is relationship?
Excellent, thank you. Maddie, then you can go ahead and enter your selection. School practices for 400 from Maddie. And the answer is, this symbol of LGBTQ plus pride may be displayed in a classroom or office to demonstrate inclusion. Okay, we have plenty of answers already. Sarah, who was first?
We have Kyle Ketstever, apologize if the pronunciation is wrong, for what is rainbow flag?
Right, the answer could have been rainbow flag or gay pride flag. Okay, Kyle, what would you like to select? Topic and dollar amount, please. All right, sex ed for 1,000, and Kyle says you pronounced his name correctly, Sarah. So sex ed for 1,000. This term is used to describe people who experience sexual attraction only after they form a strong bond with a partner. All right, Sarah, who was first to respond with the correct answer?
We have Courtney Berry at what is demisexual?
Great job, Courtney. And what category and dollar amount would you like to select, Courtney? Vocab for 1,000, going for the big money. All right, so the answer is in 1989, Kimberlé Crenshaw coined this term now used to describe the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. And Sarah, who was first with the correct response?
We have Isabel Kotlowitz. Again, apologies if my pronunciation is off, for what is intersectionality?
Great. Okay, Isabel, what category and dollar amount would you like to select? Sex ed for 600. This daily pill approved by the FDA in 2012 can help prevent HIV. Whoop. All right. Sarah, who was first with the correct response?
We have Molly Murbach for what is PrEP?
All right, Molly, you get to choose the next selection of category and dollar amount. Resilience for $800. Okay, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person describes this individual level factor associated with reduced sexual violence perpetration. And Sarah, who had the first correct answer?
We have Ali Sherrill at what is empathy?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first name. Allie?
Ali, I believe it's Ali. Again, I'm just going to make a disclaimer for apologizing. I'm not saying anybody's name. I am doing my best.
No,
Ali O'Reilly.
All right, Allie, what category and dollar amount would you like to select? Vocab for 800, please. Okay, this describes a person who's attracted to people of all genders. Wow, people are fast on that. Sarah, who was first?
We have Isabel again for what is pansexual.
All right, Isabel, maybe you're just the fastest typer. What category and dollar amount would you like to select, Isabel? Vocab for 600. An Ojibwe term used by some indigenous people to describe a culturally distinct third gender. And Sarah, who was first with the correct response?
We have Maddie again for what is two-spirit.
Oh, there's going to be a competition there. Okay, Maddie. Let's get back to our board. And what would you like to select? Sex ed for 400, please. This term is used to describe clear and explicit permission for a sexual act. Okay, Sarah, who did we have first in this answer?
Kyle for what is consent.
Ooh, all right, Kyle. And you want to cross that one off, Alex? And then what would you like to select, Kyle? Kyle chooses resilience for 1,000. This activist started the Me Too movement on MySpace in 2006. And who had the first correct answer, Sarah?
Rebecca Geiger for what is Tarana Burke.
Excellent, Rebecca. You can make the next selection and choose a category and dollar amount, please. School practices for $600. This federal law bans sex discrimination in schools. Ooh, that was really fast. Sarah, who was first for that?
Molly again at what is 10.
All right, Molly, with what is Title IX, you'll have the next selection from our board. Molly selected school practices. For 1,000, please. This district level policy protects students and teachers from discrimination and harassment based on sexual orientation and gender. Sarah, did we get oh, there I see a correct answer.
Yep, we have, that was a hard one.
Yeah.
We have Emily for what is a anti-discrimination policy, although the correct answer is what is a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy, but I assume that you'll give it to them anyways.
Yes, and I'm sorry, what was her name?
Emily.
Emily. Okay, Emily, you can make the next selection. Okay, she's going to choose school practices for $800. The two-word title for trainings where school staff can learn about LGBTQ+ identities, genders, and sexuality, and examine prejudice, assumptions, and privilege. You're supposed to wait till I finish the question before you respond. There's already like 30 responses. Who was first on that, Sarah?
We have Deborah Miller for what is safe zone.
Excellent. Okay, Deborah, we've got a few more selections on the board, all across the 200s and one 400 category. What would you like to select? Vocab for 200. This is the term used when a person's gender identity aligns with their sex at birth. And Sarah, who had the first correct answer?
We have Abby Picard for what is cisgender.
Excellent. Okay, Abby, you have 4 more category dollar amounts to choose from. What would you like? Resilience for 400, please, Alex. This term refers to the experience of school life and reflects the norms, values, teaching practices, and environment, not the weather. And Sarah, who had our first correct response there?
We have Lauren for what is school climate.
Excellent. Lauren, we have 3 categories left. Which would you like? Let's do resilience for 200, please. The opposite of risk factors, this word is used to describe factors associated with reduced sexual violence. Okay, Sarah, who had the first correct response?
We have Rebecca Geiger for what is protective.
All right, excellent. Rebecca, we have 2 more. Sex ed for 200 or school practices? Which would you like? Sex ed for 200, please. For those who have ovaries, the pituitary glands and ovaries interact to start this process during puberty. All right, Sarah, and who was first with the correct response?
It was Molly for what is menstruation.
All right, Molly. Then we have one final category. Alex, could you uncover school practices for 200? This student-led organization is intended to provide a safe, supportive environment for LGBTQ youth and teens and children. And who had the correct response for that one, Sarah?
Molly again at what is GSA, also known as Gay Straight Alliance.
All right. So can we go to the winner slide, Alex? And I think Dee is doing some calculations. Do you have your calculator finished, Dee? No. So somebody, Susanna just wrote, I've heard some call it Gender Sexuality Alliance, which is very inclusive rebranding. And that is actually what the term we'll use today. That's what they use here in New Mexico. Actually, it's Genders and Sexualities Alliance, so plurals on those. But that is true. It is, and in some areas they have QSA, or Queer Straight Alliance. Okay, Dee, it looks like you may have finished doing the higher math there. What did you come up with?
We have a winner, and the winner today is Isabel Kotlowitz. Congratulations, Isabel, for selecting those high-powered, high-money answers. Isabel, if we'll have our email addresses at the end of this presentation. If you would like to send me an email with your address, I will send you a small prize from the great state of New Mexico.
All right, so thank you everybody for taking part in playing this game with us. We're hoping it was a nice introduction to the things that we're going to be talking about coming up. Alex, I think if you can go to the next slide, we will say thank you to you for inspiring this game idea for us today and for helping us out with actually maneuvering through the slides. And thanks to the people who created this Jeopardy game as well. And now we're going to get into the heart of our presentation. I think Dee, Alex, do I have control now? Let's see.
You've been given control.
Okay. Just taking a little bit longer to, I guess, get through the Ethernet. Did you want to start, Dee?
Sure. So first of all, I would just like to say that I'm very impressed with the knowledge in the room about our Jeopardy answers. Clearly, we need to level up if we do this again for this audience. You all are so knowledgeable. Thank you for playing and participating. That was a lot of fun. And so now we're going to move on to talking about our presentation and improves, and that acronym stands for Policies to Reduce the Onset of Violence in Educational Settings. And, whoop, do you go back? Dr. Cruz and I are presenting today, but we are part of a larger research team that includes Courtney Fitzgerald, Ilian Zhu, and Melissa Shipp, all of the University of New Mexico. And we have deep gratitude to our partners, Equality New Mexico and New Mexico Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network. Finally, this project was supported in part by the dedicated health research funds from the UNM School of Medicine. We're going to start by talking about terminology and acronyms to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the words that we use. And so our research team decided to use the term sexual and gender minority for this project. And different communities have different opinions about the use of those terms. We chose to use them because even though we can put a plus at the end of LGBTQ+, we feel like many identities are left out of that. And we're always trying to balance inclusion with length of the acronym. And so that's why we made that decision. So for the purposes of this presentation, we identify sexual minority as anyone who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, demisexual, queer, or any sexuality other than heterosexual. And we define gender minority as anyone who identifies as transgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, gender fluid, two-spirit, non-binary, or any gender other than cisgender. Next slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and significance of this project. So our research team really looks at violence as a public health issue. And we believe that sexual violence prevention should be elevated by the public health community. And that's because there's now a wealth of research evidence that indicates that both experiencing violence and witnessing violence leads to a whole host of negative health outcomes that are of importance to the public health community. And just some of these include substance abuse, suicide, depression, school dropout, perpetration of violence in the future, and a whole host of chronic diseases. Next slide. This graphic is known as the spectrum of prevention. And so on the bottom of this graphic is strengthening individual knowledge and skills. And that represents the very important work that many preventionists do in schools and organizations. And this work is very effective. When we can get in and talk to individual people and increase their skills and their knowledge around violence, we do see good outcomes in the reduction of violence. However, this approach is costly, as you all know. It's very time intensive, and even if we had unlimited amounts of money and time, I don't think we would be able to reach every individual person with the dosage that we need to see an outcome. And so the idea of a spectrum of prevention is that as you move up the levels of the spectrum, you can reach more people with less resources. And so I'll just go through them quickly. When we go up to promoting community education, that might be something like a media campaign or something that's educating a whole community. When we talk about educating providers, that might be providing education to teachers, to senior leadership, to people in HR. And the idea is then they will be able to disseminate that information to the people in their organization. So you train one person, that person trains a whole host of other people. When we talk about fostering coalitions and networks, these are strategic prevention efforts through many different kinds of people working in very different kinds of capacities to minimize the duplication of effort. The orange bar, changing organizational practices, that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. An organization can be any kind of group or body. And so we're talking about things like making comprehensive anti-discrimination policies, making HR policies, providing signage that indicates that all people are welcome and included. Those are organizational level practices. And then finally, when we get to the top of the spectrum of prevention, the area that has the most, the potential for the greatest impact is influencing policy and legislation. And we usually refer to this as a capital P policy, state level policies, national level policies. And those are things like Title IX. Next slide. So in terms of reducing violence among high school students, there is evidence that school policies that are inclusive for sexual and gender minority students actually have the potential to reduce violence among all students. And what are we talking about when we're talking about an inclusive school climate? What are the elements of that? Some elements of an inclusive school climate are a comprehensive anti-bullying policy that includes both sexual minority and gender minority students. A sex ed curriculum that includes issues that are relevant to LGBTQ plus youth, and also curriculum just in general that talks about the importance and the contributions of LGBTQ plus people. A GSA or a QSA, a Gay Straight Alliance or a Queer Straight Alliance or a Genders and Sexualities Alliance, the presence of one of those. And school staff training, in which educators and other school staff can learn about how to provide best quality education and inclusive environments to sexual and gender minority students. For example, safe zone trainings. Next slide. There's now a lot of research around the impact of school level interventions for reducing rates of violence victimization. So we see that sexual and gender minority inclusive policies in one study were associated with lower rates of bullying, victimization, and perpetration, and that's among all students, not just sexual and gender minority students. Another study found that sexual and minority students who attended schools with GSAs reported lower rates of dating violence, being threatened at school, and attempted suicide. And a different study found that students perceived their schools as being safer for gender nonconforming males when the curriculum included LGBTQ issues and the school had a GSA. Next slide. And again, this is really just a snapshot of the wealth of research that we have available to demonstrate this right now. Another study showed that for gender minority youth, connection to school personnel was associated with greater feelings of safety. And that's an outcome that we can see when we have that inclusive teacher and staff training, better connections. Curricula that included positive representations of LGBTQ people were associated with lower rates of absenteeism and sexual and gender minority related bullying among those youth. And finally, having an SGM inclusive curriculum in another study was associated with lower rates of in-school harassment and assault, specifically related to gender and sexuality. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cruz, who is going to talk about the purpose of the current study.
Great, thank you, Dee. So the reason we decided to do the study we're doing, as Dee said, there is other research out there that gave us the idea to look at this in New Mexico. But what we were excited about is that our Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey started collecting data on high school students and their not only LGB status, which we had already been collecting, but started collecting data on transgender status. And so that gave us this opportunity to be able to look across all high school students in New Mexico through this population-based sample to be able to see how these different policies affected our student population. And so our specific purpose was to evaluate the effect of some of these policies and practices on violence victimization among New Mexico high school students as a whole, so all students, and then also among sexual and gender minority students. So we looked at 3 different general categories of outcome. Those included sexual violence, dating violence, and bullying. And the bullying was both in school and electronic. The reason we looked at multiple forms of violence was because there's a lot of evidence that shows that these are interconnected with regard to their risk and protective factors. So we wanted to see if the policies had a broader effect than just on sexual violence. So the methods that we used, we did a secondary data analysis. We used statewide surveillance data, and our first source was the 2016 school health profiles data. So this is a survey that's conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They do it among a stratified random sample of schools across the country, and they ask both the school principals and the lead health educators at the schools a series of questions about the climate in the school. So that was one of our sources for our policies and practices. Then we also used our community partners at Equality New Mexico and the New Mexico Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network to get other information on school policies and practices. Our outcome data, we used the New Mexico Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey, and that from 2017. We wanted the practices to be put in place before the outcomes we were looking at. So we made sure those were in place in 2016, and then in 2017, when the Youth Risk Resiliency Survey was conducted, we used that to identify 5 outcomes of violence measures among high school students in New Mexico. Now, for our specific study, we only included those schools that had participated in both of these 2 surveys. So as I said earlier, for the school health profiles, there's a stratified random sample. The same thing happens for the Youth Risk Resiliency Survey, which is also conducted through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we wanted to make sure that we had both the predictive factors and the outcome factors for all the schools that were participating in our sample. So the specific questions that we drew from the school health profiles, one was regarding inclusive sex ed, and that would mean that it included information that was relevant to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. We also looked at the school's staff training, and specifically, did they have training around teaching and working with students of different sexual orientations or different gender identities. So the data from our partners that we used around school policies and practices, one was that overarching comprehensive anti-discrimination or anti-bullying policy that prohibits bullying in schools among teachers as well as students based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And that "and" piece was key. We had a lot of schools that had school districts that had policies based on sexual orientation, but very few districts that also included gender identity. And that we got from Equality New Mexico. They did an audit across the state and looked at all the school districts here in New Mexico. And then the Genders and Sexualities Alliance, they keep a list of all of the schools that they work with across the state that have a Genders and Sexualities or Gay Straight Alliance in the school system. So the outcome data from the New Mexico Youth Risk Resiliency Survey, we did have 5 violence outcomes that we looked at. The first 2 were around sexual violence. One is a lifetime sexual intercourse or rape, and the other is any sexual violence in the last 12 months. And then the other 3 variables that we looked at for violence outcomes were dating violence, and then in-school bullying, and then electronic bullying. So with our data analysis, we first looked at descriptive statistics. We wanted to make sure, since we did have to restrict our sample to the schools that had done both of the surveys, both the school health profiles and the YRS Youth Risk Resiliency Survey, we wanted to make sure that the population we were looking at was still representative of the rest of our state. And as you'll hear from Dee in a little bit, our state does have a population that's different from many other states. We also wanted to identify any potential confounding covariates. And so we were looking at associations between demographic characteristics and both the outcome and the policies and practices to see if there were associations there. After doing those analyses, we then built a model that we looked at for each outcome separately, where we included the factors that were identified as potential confounding factors. And then after that, we conducted a subset analysis focusing on sexual minority students and gender minority students. And we really wanted to do that separately. In a lot of the literature, you see LGBTQ just all lumped together. And we really wanted to make sure we looked at the group separately if we had sufficient data for that. One thing that we were not able to do was to do some specific analyses around even smaller subgroups, because we didn't have, for example, to look at intersectionality, we didn't have enough data to be able to look at gender minority Native American students, for example, which would be nice, but we didn't have sufficient data for that. So Dee's gonna take over here and talk about some of our results with you.
Thank you so much. So we did find that the demographics of our sample in this study did reflect the demographics of New Mexico students overall. And so in New Mexico, about 16.5% of students identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or unsure of their sexual orientation, sexual identity. And also, as Theresa mentioned, we were really excited to have the first round of data around gender identity. We were one of the first states in the country to do that. And so that really... And so what we found was that 5.4% of students in New Mexico identified as transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or unsure of their gender identity. We also looked at housing stability. About 6.5% of students in New Mexico reported living in unstable housing. Around 9% reported that they're foreign born. And about half the students in New Mexico live in a metro area, and about half the students live in a more rural area. We do have a largely rural state. And this analysis included 90 schools and represented 12,734 students. Next slide. So the good news is that nearly 75% of high schools in New Mexico had at least one of the 4 sexual gender minority inclusion policies in place. And so we can see that 5 schools actually had all 4 SGM inclusive policies in place, while 23 schools had no SGM inclusive policies in place. Next slide. The most common inclusion practice that was reported by high schools was sex ed relevant to LGBTQ students? And so out of the 90 schools, 40 had inclusive sex ed, while only 24 had a comprehensive sexual and gender minority anti-bullying policy. 35 had a gay straight alliance or genders and sexualities alliance, and 29 out of 90 had inclusive staff training. Next slide. We also looked at our outcomes, and we saw that sexual and gender minority students in our sample are at increased risk for violence victimization, as are sexual and gender minority students in New Mexico overall. And so nearly 17% of sexual and gender minority students reported having experienced forced sex at some time during their life, compared to 5.1% of their cisgender straight identified counterparts. And so that's a prevalence of about 3 times for the sexual and gender minority students. And we see the same pattern with both sexual violence and dating violence. In the area of bullying, we see that about a quarter of sexual and gender minority students reported experiencing school bullying or e-bullying in the last 12 months, compared to 16 and 12% of their straight and cisgender counterparts, respectively. Next slide. And now Dr. Cruz is going to talk about the relationship between each policy and each violence outcome.
Great, thank you, Dee. So what we're trying to look at, the overall purpose, was to find out if policies, if any one of these policies was associated with any of these forms of violence among all students. That was our first category, is just overall were students safer, having less incidents of violence if the schools had a policy in place. Now, just to orient you to the figure, because I'll be using this on the next few slides, on the left-hand side, going down, you see the 4 different policies or school practices that we wanted to look at. Existence of a genders and sexualities or gay straight alliance, the comprehensive anti-bullying, anti-harassment policy, and inclusive sex education, and teacher training around LGBTQ youth. So then over on the right-hand side, each of these circles represents an odds ratio. So an odds ratio is used to describe the odds of an event happening given a specific, in this case, policy or practice being in place. The 2 diamonds on either side of the circle represent what's called a confidence interval. And this helps us be able to tell if the results we got were just by chance. And so what we want to see on these slides is that the entire confidence interval bounded by the diamonds is all to the left-hand side of the number 1, that vertical bar that you see there. So as you can see here, that wasn't the case. So in looking at if these policies were associated with decreased violence among all students, what we found is that was not true for any of the policies we looked at. So this one is an example, the forced sex policy, but all 5 of them had similar results, again, among all students. So then we wanted to look at each policy with regard to specific groups of our subgroups that we were interested in. So here we looked at sexual minority students and found that if they were in a school with inclusive sex ed, they were less likely to have experienced forced sex in their lifetime. And that's here in the, I guess, turquoise blue colored boxes. You could see it's about 75%, an odds ratio of 0.75, which is about a 25% that they're less likely to have experienced forced sex. So then when we look at sexual minority students in schools with inclusive sex ed, we also found that they were less likely to have experienced sexual violence in the past 12 months. And so that's about 30% less likely to have experienced sexual violence if there was inclusive sex ed in their school. So then we wanted to look at bullying as well, we mentioned earlier, and we found with the bullying variable that for gender minority students in schools that with inclusive sex ed, that they were about 35% less likely to have experienced bullying if they were in a school with inclusive sex ed. We also found with regard to bullying that sexual minority students in schools that had inclusive teacher training were less likely to have experienced school bullying, and about 25% less likely. So those were our significant findings from the study. We looked at all of those variables, but these 5 outcomes that I showed you were the specific ones that did have significant findings associated with them. So now Dee's gonna summarize the results and talk a little bit about what they mean.
So our takeaway here is that inclusive policies in school, especially inclusive sex ed, do have the potential to reduce sexual violence among sexual minority and gender minority students. And staff training also appears to have the potential to reduce bullying among sexual and gender minority students. Next slide. Some of the limitations of our study. Our data collection methods lack nuance. So what we mean by that is when we talk about, we're basing this on one question or maybe a series of questions that an administrator answers about, is your sex ed curriculum inclusive for LGBTQ+ students? And that could mean a lot of different things. Like, and so for example, someone could check that box as yes, and that means that one time they mentioned something about sexual minority students having sex, right? Or that could mean that they have a whole unit on inclusive sex ed relevant to LGBTQ+ students. It could mean a lot of different things. Staff training could mean that they went to one workshop for 1 hour one time, or it could mean that every month they do a workshop around sexual and gender minority students and best practices. So this method isn't really like fine-tuned in the way that we would like to see. Another limitation is that we have a limited ability to make causal inferences. And so this is a correlational study. And that means that we're looking at one thing against another thing happening at the same time, but we can't really say that one thing caused another thing. So we can say that teacher training is associated with reduced bullying, but we can't say that teacher training causes a reduction in bullying. In order to do that, we would have to do a much larger study with the control group. Dr. Cruz already mentioned the problem of small numbers. We have a low power to detect significant differences in smaller populations. And so while we would like to do this research specifically around how these policies are different for Black and Indigenous students of color, for example, or we would like to look at how they're different among subpopulations of the LGBTQ+ community, which is in no way homogenous. When we start to dive down like that, we have very small numbers, and so we can't conduct this kind of analysis with those numbers. That doesn't mean that it can't be done, it just needs to be done in a different way. And finally, students live in multifaceted, complicated worlds where things are happening outside of school. And so there are a lot of different factors there, and so external factors, especially family support, probably do have a greater impact than school factors, and that's not captured in this study. Next slide. In terms of the next steps, so the funding for this project was a short 1 year, small amount of money. So now we're in the dissemination phase of this project. We would like to, we're working on writing a manuscript and thinking about ways to get this information out into the community so that maybe other states can replicate this kind of research in their state. Were we to continue and go a little bit further with this project, it would be wonderful to do a deeper dive into the actual implementation of the policy or practice. So to answer some of those questions about what does their inclusive sex ed look like, what does their teacher training look like. We would also be interested in investigating the impact of policies and practices on other outcomes of interest. For example, substance use or behavioral health. How do these policies impact those kinds of things? It would be fantastic to do qualitative research with students to gather data about the school climate. For example, a school might have a GSA, but the climate is so homophobic that students don't feel safe going there. They don't feel safe being out and showing up at a GSA. And so they might have one, but people aren't really comfortable using it. And the only way to really get that information is to be on the ground talking to students about what their experience is like in their own schools. And another branch area is to assess the impact of the Safe Schools for All Students Act. So this is a very exciting thing that happened in New Mexico. It passed the New Mexico legislature in 2019. And the act mainly serves to outline the procedure for bullying, like what happens when there's an incident of bullying. How is that reported? What are the prevention policies and what's happening around bullying? But what makes that relevant to this discussion is that it specifically names sexual orientation and gender identity as a protected group. And so now, were we to repeat this study, it should actually be 100% of schools in New Mexico that could say that they have a district level policy that is a comprehensive anti-bullying and anti-harassment policy that includes both sexual minority and gender, or sexual identity and gender identity. And those are just some ideas for the future. And now we will open up for questions.
And not only questions, if there are also comments about if you've done similar research or what your experiences have been with these policies or programs in your communities, we would be interested in hearing that as well. I think, Sarah, were you going to bring us questions from the chat?
Yeah, I'm happy to do. So far, it looks like we've only gotten a question that seems to have been resolved, but folks asked if you can share some more information on why you use the term forced sex instead of rape.
Oh, sure. So I have to preface that with saying it wasn't our decision. The Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey is based on the CDC YRBS, Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And that's the way the question's worded there, but more to the context about why is I think that they found that high school students might not consider what happened to them to have been a rape, but would respond in the positive that they had had a sexual act against their consent. And so I think that's why the forced sex was included in there instead of the specific word rape. They felt that students might not respond to that as well, or might not see what happened to them as a rape.
Thank you. And then we have another question that just came in that says, it is from Jen, and it says, from what I am understanding, you're studying if there is a correlation between these policies and practices and students being less likely to be victims of violence. Have you looked at, or do you intend to look at, if there is a correlation between these policies and practices and students/teachers being less likely to be violent?
So I'll start, Dee, and then if you have anything to add. I think that would be an excellent thing to look at. The questions, though, in the survey, so first is we don't have any questions about the teachers in the YRS. It's only about the students. But the questions about the students is the likelihood that they admit to perpetration is really small. So usually if you do have those data, it's very small numbers. And there is not a lot of data on perpetration. There's not a question on perpetration specifically of sexual violence. And so with that data set, we're unable to look at that. There's a potential that we could look at those questions with some primary data collection. And I don't know, maybe others have done that.
Yeah, I would love to hear about anyone else's experience with that. It's my understanding that people think that it would be very difficult to get school districts on board with asking questions about violence perpetration. And of course, you know, when we talk about violence prevention, we want to look at preventing perpetration. That's really the data that we want. But it's hard to get buy-in for those kinds of questions. So yeah, if anyone has experience with that or has any ideas about framing that in terms of having the conversation with school districts, that would be wonderful to hear.
And it looks like Jen just had a follow-up comment to that, clarifying that they were thinking more along the lines of asking victims if their perpetrators were in their schools.
Oh, The survey does not currently ask that, and I have not seen that proposed anywhere, but that would be interesting to see the answers of that. I know some campus climate surveys do ask that, but as far as I know, none of the high school surveys ask that.
And then one question, she asks to evaluate the policies in combination with one another or just as separate items. For example, looked at results from a school with a GSA and inclusive sex ed.
Do you want to start with that, Dee, or would you like me to?
We did, so that was our intention at the beginning of the study, to look at whether each individual policy had an impact on the outcomes of interest, and then to look at the combinations or if the number of policies had an impact. And I think, if I remember correctly, the results that we got around that were a little bit confusing, and it started to get a little bit out of our control with all of the variables and the things that we were looking at. I don't think we found any compelling evidence to move that forward. So we started looking at, does one policy versus two policies, this combination of policies and that combination of policies. And we just weren't really seeing anything that conclusive that jumped out to us. So that was a part of our original research design, and we ended up dropping it. That's the way I remember it. Dr. Cruz, if you want to clarify.
Right. It was unusual because we had, so we didn't look specifically if it was this policy and that policy. We did, as Dee said, we found that it was inconclusive kind of thing. But we did find that if you had 3 policies in place, regardless of which ones they were, 3 of these policies or practices, that you had reduced risk versus if you only had 1 policy. So we did see that, but then when we tried to break it down and look at specific ones, that got a little bit more complex and was the results weren't clear for us to make any clear statements about it. And that's, I think, to Dee's point about why we were looking for other opportunities to collect more data. Whenever you use a secondary data set, you can't always have the information that you wish you had. And so we were thinking about ways that we can try to get more clarity on specific policies or practices and what that actually meant on the ground in the schools of how things were happening. For example, we had some principals who said they had a Genders and Sexualities Alliance in their school, but when we actually looked into whether they were active with the GSA network in our state, we found out that they were there kind of in name only. And so that's the kind of information that we really need to make sure we can get from on the ground in the schools, I think, before we can answer those questions fully.
Another question in here from Kelly that I think is a really good one. They want to know if you have suggestions for starting the conversations with schools or engaging districts to look at their policies.
Yeah, I can take this one. So as we mentioned, there is a wealth of research out there now that demonstrates that these kinds of policies can have an impact. And so, just the references that we have will be available on this presentation. It's been useful for some of our partners to make like an infographic or a fact sheet or something like that, summarizing that information and then presenting that to a school board or presenting that to an administrator. It's always a good practice to first find an ally within the school district, figure out who that person is who is going to be a champion for these kinds of policies or a champion for sexual and gender minority students, and have them kind of help you to move it forward. But if you want to send me an email, I'd be glad to talk to you a little bit more about infographics and things that are available there. It really has to be like a very distilled down, very simple, high level summary that, you know, these practices can make a difference in reducing violence. And so depending on the climate of the school district and the school, you know, there may not be that much resistance to implementing these policies if there's a demonstration that it could impact all students. Some school districts say we don't have any, you know, gay students, we don't have any transgender students. That was a wonderful thing that came out of including this question in our YRS, was that we could demonstrate to school districts, like, we actually have, you know, almost 6% of students who identify as a gender minority or identify as transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or unsure of their gender. And furthermore, those students are in every single district in New Mexico. And so, you know, that argument that this doesn't apply to us because we don't have any of those students didn't really hold water anymore. So those are my ideas. I think someone asked about how to identify an ally in the school. If they do have a GSA or a QSA, obviously that person would be a good ally.
So the GSAs do have a student leader, or I forget what they call them, the mentors, because it's a student-led group, but they do have a teacher sponsor. That's what they're called. They have a teacher that sponsors the effort within the schools, and so those people could help.
And then go into the school and see who's flagging. You know, someone has a signal somewhere in their office. Somebody has a rainbow flag. Somebody has a something that includes that their office or their classroom is a safe space. Those are very powerful signals to LGBTQ students. And hopefully there's at least one or more teachers who have something like that.
We have a question from Amanda that asks, did the survey ask whether sexual violence / dating violence / bullying had occurred in the school / home versus friend / family? I'm curious about it, or I'm curious about if that factor was included when students disclosed about being forced to have sex.
So that was included for the bullying question, whether that occurred in school, but for the sexual violence and dating violence, they did not ask the location of where the violence occurred, only for the bullying.
And someone else asks, you mentioned 25% of schools reported having comprehensive sex ed relevant to SGM students. Was the school self-reporting, or what criteria was used to determine whether the sex education actually was comprehensive and relevant? Or what was used to determine that? Or is it just similar to what you all said about GSAs?
Hi, Izzy. Thanks for asking that question. That is an example of the lack of nuance of our data collection. So we got that information from one question that was answered by the person who fills out the school health profiles. Do you have sex ed curriculum that's relevant to LGBTQ+ students? One option would be to engage Planned Parenthood as another community partner who in New Mexico is very active and does wonderful inclusive sex ed, and find out, you know, which schools they have been in and what that inclusive sex ed looks like.
And would like to know if your study is published in a peer-reviewed publication.
So we're working on that. No, it's not yet, but we do intend to. And I was thinking we could, when that happens, we could potentially share that, I guess, with CalCASA. I don't know if there's a way to have links to things, to people who may have attended the conference, or that people could look back to. Or you could individually send us an email if you're interested in that, and we could let you know when that happens.
So it looks like that was the end of the questions in the chat.
Oh, I just saw somebody asked if the surveys were conducted in the school setting, and yes, they are. We do a huge recruitment effort in the spring. So it's the YRS, or the YRBS in other states, is done every 2 years on odd years, and the data, the process is for us that we do the recruiting in the spring and try to get schools. We have to do superintendents and then go down to the principal level and ask them. And so we do a hard sell to try to recruit people to participate. And it's not only questions about violence. They have questions about substance abuse. They have questions about sexual health. They have questions about just a whole variety of risk factors, and in New Mexico about protective factors. We added those to our survey here. But so there is a heavy amount of work that goes into trying to recruit school districts and the principals themselves. And there are some districts that frankly refuse to participate. And then most of them participate. I think we only had 4 in 2019 of our school districts in the state that did not participate at all. But we also had a few that participated but said, we don't want any of the questions that have to do with sex on our surveys, for example. And there's a corollary survey that goes to middle school students. It's a little bit smaller and they tend to have fewer questions on sexual behaviors and substance abuse among middle school students. Again, I think with a little bit with the blinders of that doesn't happen among students that age kind of thing. But also, as we found, like with trying to identify gender minority students, is there were a large proportion, even on the high school survey, of students that didn't know what that question meant when it asked if you're gender fluid, gender queer, or gender non-conforming. One of the options was, I don't understand the question. And we did have a substantial proportion of students that didn't know what the question meant. So I think for that one, they're hesitant to introduce it at the middle school level because they're thinking if there's such a proportion of kids at the high school level that don't understand it, that they would have the same but greater issue at middle school level. But some of it is just districts don't think that you should be asking a 12-year-old about their sexual behavior because they couldn't be sexually active. And for most of us here, we would know that that's not the case, unfortunately, all the time.
We have another question that's asking if you all have any tips for helping schools change their climate in a state with no home laws, and then someone following up asking what those laws are.
So we don't have a no promo homo law here, so I don't know about specifically trying to address that. But I think what Dee was talking about earlier with school climate is trying to have some of the data that shows that schools are safer if you have these different policies in place. That they can be safer for all kids, like the policies around anti-bullying that are specifying gender and gender identity and sexual orientation. They've also been found to be effective in reducing bullying among all kids and making it a safer environment for all kids. And so I think that could have the potential to change some minds. But we do have school districts here who are they don't specifically have that law, but they're very resistant to having policies, or as Dee said, that they just want to deny that there are any children in their districts that are gender or sexual minorities. So I don't know, Dee, if you have any other suggestions for addressing that.
I don't, work with coalitions and people who are allowed to do lobbying, and I just keep getting the information out there that this is really an issue of safety for all students and all young people and all people. And the data about the, just the prevalence of young people who identify in that way, which is always increasing. Someone else asked about students who had to get parental permission for the survey. I just wanted to address that. The YRS is an opt-out survey. Is that correct, Theresa? So a parent would actually have to say that they didn't want their student or their child to complete that survey rather than getting explicit permission to take the survey.
And I don't recall the specific participation rate, but I think it's around 72. That's what sticks in my mind, 72 to 75% in New Mexico.
It's really good. It's a wealth of data. We found, Dr. Cruz and I worked on a couple different projects in schools, and we found that it's really difficult to introduce a new survey into a school. And so that's why we rely so much on secondary data analysis. Like, kids are just overwhelmed with the amount of things they have to bring home to get signed and to get filled out. And so anytime we want to try to introduce some sort of new survey that we want to give to students, it's like a really an uphill battle. So to the extent that any of those instruments are already there and can be used and can be, in some cases, modified, like we really wanted to get the gender identity data, and it took years. It took probably about 4 years of having a coalition of folks at UNM and at the health department working to both change hearts and minds and make the research case for including that question on the YRS and then getting that question added onto the YRS.
We had a couple more questions come in. Someone just has a follow-up comment. It does seem like parents can be a barrier to doing this work, and is asking, I'm sure the both of you and then also maybe folks in the chat, if anyone has been able to partner or collaborate with parents to make it easier. I know we usually talk about partner teachers and counselors.
I think that's a great idea and an area that's really ripe for further exploration. We do have the results of a different study that showed that family supports were the most important protective or resilience factor for against violence, victimization, and self-harm among gender minority students. And so, you know, it's clear that family support is very important, probably more important than school support. We kind of tend to do work in schools because it's a little bit easier to reach school staff and administrators and students, but once they go home, it's kind of hard to engage parents, and that's been a problem for prevention, I think, across the board. So I think that's a really excellent area for future prevention work, is to, like, you know, work with families, work with parents, and that's also very difficult because, you know, parents have different levels of their ability to engage in work like that, different levels of willingness to engage in work like that. But especially for gender and sexual minority students, making sure that their family environment is supportive and affirming is like that, in my opinion, would be like the top level of ensuring safety and well-being for these students. And I hope that we're able to do that at some point, like in the broader sexual violence prevention community, because I think that's really where a lot of the change is going to happen.
Someone else would also like to know if there were supports identified and provided for students if they were to feel uncomfortable or triggered during the process of taking the survey.
So in general, they do not provide extra supports other than if the school has you know, a counselor on site. I do know that is, so in New Mexico, we chose not to ask questions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ACEs questions, the adverse childhood experiences, but that asks about numerous negative experiences of child abuse and sexual abuse that have happened in the child's life. And New Mexico chose not to ask that because they felt like there was not adequate support for that. They're called modules, but for that module of questions, that there wasn't adequate support or places to refer children to if they were triggered or responded positively. But to my knowledge, other than having a school counselor there, they do not provide other supports for the students. Do you know any differently?
I don't know that that's any different. I don't know if there's any, I don't think there's any language in the survey that says if you want to, like, this is, there probably is language about whether it's optional and what to do if you want to talk to someone about it.
Yeah, there for sure is language that says you don't have to answer any of the questions if they make you feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't get to if somebody's triggered. I don't know, in other states, they may do it differently, but here, as far as I know, they don't have other supports.
I think we just have a couple comments in the chat. The youth advocate from Oregon who remarks that if students taking a survey or doing things like potentially them, that they are available to have the advocate in there or have the advocate in office. And Lizzie just put in the chat a Planned Parenthood resource. With a follow-up question, I'm curious, have you all heard anything about how GSAs have been adapting to virtual remote? I especially worry about youth who can't be open about their sexual or gender identities in their
So I know that in New Mexico, actually Alex is doing some work through Fierce Pride / Heal Plus to do an online healthy relationship curriculum with the GSA network. And so that's at least one thing that's going to be available virtually to our students. Yeah, it seems like a very precarious time, very dangerous time for a lot of our students, and that's a concern of mine as well. Looks like we had a request to go back to the resources slide.
References slide?
References slide.
So I don't have the slide showing anymore. Oh, there it goes. Thank you, Alex. And I believe all the presentations will be available after today. So if you're trying to madly write things down, I think you'll be able to just get the whole presentation and be able to follow up with that. And somebody else had asked about permission to take a photo shot of a slide. And if anybody wanted to do that with the slide, that's perfectly fine as well. So someone asked if there's a good contact for setting that up, which I'm not sure if they're talking about for GSAs, an online GSA. Do you know if, I wouldn't want to give out somebody's name, but we might be able to link you up with somebody in our state that could help with that if you wanted to email D or I to find out what they're doing here and how they're coordinating that.
I put Alex's email in the chat. She's hidden behind me because I have a fake living room, but I did get her consent to share that.
Okay.
Online GSA curriculum.
I didn't want to tell people to just go ahead and email her.
You can move really fast.
Yeah.
We can see you.
Thanks again, Alex, for helping us with the slides today. Well, if there are no other questions, I guess we just want to say thank you to all of you for coming today, for being interested in this work, and for sharing your Friday, I guess it's probably afternoon for everybody on here now. Well, maybe not Hawaii, but we really do appreciate your being here and being interested in this work. And if if you have questions or want to hear more about it, please feel free to contact D or I. Or Alex, I guess, about the GSAs. But thank you for taking the time today. Dee, I don't know if you had any last words.
Just thanks, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity, and it would be nice to see you all in person, but it's also nice to connect in this way. So hopefully next year we'll all be in the in the same building, and we can keep up the great work. Thanks everyone for all that you do.
Yeah, and Theresa and Dee and Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. This concludes our last NSAC workshop of 2020. And to echo Dee's comments, fingers crossed over here that we will see you the first week of August next year in 2021 in person in Anaheim. So send good vibes. Thanks so much, everyone.
And everybody be bold.